Moderator.
Meeting is now streaming live on custom live streaming service. Oké, ik heb geen scherm. Als dit stopt, krijg ik dan mijn...
Ik krijg zo die video. Start with video.
Zullen we zien iets opgenomen wordt. For 6 attending. What is
Well, the thing is, we humans can't be happy and whole unless nature is happy and whole. What makes us really happy, apart from our own relationships with each other, is spending time in the forest, in wild forest, in a forest that's brought itself from out of itself. We know now from the science that we need biodiversity to absorb carbon, to produce cloud-seeding chemicals, basically to regulate the climate of the Earth. We have to have healthy biodiversity. So, even from a purely functional scientific point of view, we can make an excellent case that we can't have a healthy human society, or a healthy economy, or whatever we want, unless nature is healthy. We can't. I mean, if we destroy all the rainforests and pollute all the oceans, then what's going to regulate the climate? We are nature. We came out of nature. And if we want to have a healthy psychological life, we've got to have a healthy nature. We've got to have biodiversity, wild biodiversity in nature. So that's why it's very important to rewild. It's important to rewild on 2 levels, therefore. One is we need to rewild so the Earth, Gaia, can regulate her climate so that we can have a happy life. And we need to rewild ourselves psychologically through rewilding nature. Once we rewild nature, we realize wild parts of ourselves that we didn't know existed. Because when you do that, you start to feel the soul of nature. And the soul of nature is your own soul. The soul of nature is the human soul. They're indissolubly connected. So it's very important to rewild for all those reasons.
A warm welcome to our session, Rewilding as a Biodiversity Engine. I'm Guido Boucher, Chairman of True Nature Foundation. Our mission is to make Europe a greener, healthier and wilder place. Bottom up, project by project, always together with the local communities. We just saw a wonderful video capturing the essence of what rewilding is all about. The narrator, Dr. Stephen Harding, research fellow at the Schumacher College, is with us in the audience today. We are nature. We came out of nature. So if you want a healthy life, you got to have a healthy nature. You got to have biodiversity. That's why it is important to rewild. Thank you so much, Stefan, for your wise and powerful words. And thank you, Sam Chevalier, for producing the video at Rewild TV South Africa and your permission to share it with our audience today. Our session of 90 minutes consists of two parts. In the first one, hosted by yours truly, we bring together 3 rewilding practitioners from around the globe. In the second part, hosted by my colleague Marijke Brune, we have 2 rewilding funders, one from the public and one from the private end. Both parts, with the practitioners and funders, are followed by an interactive 15-minute session with you. Via our chat box, you can send us your questions and comments. If you want to address a question specifically to one of our speakers, please indicate so. You can also respond to the 2 online polls we will conduct during this session. To do so, scan your QR code with your mobile. The first question is, what comes to your mind if you hear the word rewilding? So you see the screen now, which you can use to fill in the answers. So if we continue, then we really love to see your comments and responses and your questions. So don't hesitate to send them in and get in touch with the speakers and ourselves. So let's move now to the core of our session today, and that is our wonderful speakers. We feel most privileged to present you some truly outstanding rewilding practitioners. First and foremost, the amazing Christine Tompkins, former CEO of Patagonia, the outdoor brand. She acquired with her late husband, Doug Tompkins, over millions of acres of land in southern Argentina and Chile, turning them into vast wilderness reserves, which over time evolved into 15 national parks and 2 marine parks today. Joining us in the early hours of the day from Los Angeles with her morning tea and maybe her Labrador, we are very honored to have you with us, Christine. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I don't know if you guys can see me. It's hard to say. Shall I move ahead? I'm Werner. There seems to be.
I'm afraid
There we go. I think that's it. All right. Well, good morning, everybody. Nice to be here and participate in all of this. My name is Chris, and I'm at the family ranch in California, having come out of Chile very rapidly at the end of March, as everybody was sorting themselves out because of COVID. I'm going to take just 5 minutes to talk about some of the things we're doing. I'm going to throw a map up here so you have a sense of where we work and what we're doing. See if I can get this.
Yep.
We have been working largely in the Southern Cone between Chile and Argentina. My husband and I were refugees out of the business life and community and decided to spend the last third of our life protecting key habitat and making associations with both governments in those countries to donate them back as national parks for the patrimony of all Chileans and all Argentines. Along the way, about 15 years ago, we realized that in some of our projects, though not all, there were significant species missing And in some cases, the apex species were missing. And an example of this is jaguars in northeastern Argentina, which we have begun to work on to bring back in our Ibará Park project, which is just under 2 million acres of territory. So a lot of that no conflict zone. So it's possible to work on this species. And another example, in the same park, the green-shouldered macaws who have been missing from Argentina for 130 years. And I was telling my colleagues on this talk this morning that we just had the first chick born in the wild last week. So as many of you must know, rewilding has its great days and really tough days, but we have had some great successes with the species. And in Chile, the way mule deer was almost extinct entirely in the Andes region, and we're bringing that back. So let me get out of this and come back to the talk at hand. I think it's important to mention how we look at rewilding. When we first began our efforts, as I said, we were really focused on territory, and then realizing that that was, in fact, the creation of national parks is just one of the strategies you have to do what you're trying to do, which is rewilding a territory, bringing it back to its full ecological functional level. And that changed our work profoundly ever since. So rewilding, I know, is the term often considered to be just bringing extirpated species back. But in our minds, rewilding starts its role at the top. So that's acquiring, establishing large territories where rewilding is possible, putting those territories into some sort of protection that has protections around it that will go the distance. It's 100 years, it's 150 years, you can't read into the future. So establishing the territory, and then sometimes this is the sea, establishing the species, doing all the pre-work of who's missing and what can we do to bring them back. And then rewilding ourselves, and that's what we call it anyway, because you can't do this kind of work. You can't even champion this kind of work wherever you are unless you yourselves, the communities, local, regional, national, global communities, agree that our future depends on a healthy ecosystem. And you can't have that, as was said by the gentleman from Schumacher, unless everything is functioning. And that's the big problem, because every day the conversion of nature to production is winning the race over those of us in conservation who are trying to beat the clock. And it's becoming one giant race to get someplace first. So that's what we do. We work very extensively, especially in local communities. We see that as essential for any sort of conservation work, whether it's just rewilding specific species or protecting land or sea, because at the final chapter, the defense of these areas, the defense of the communities themselves, comes from the benefits they get from this kind of work, and they adapt it as their own. So for us, this is really, it's not just a personal ethos, it's also a very fundamental structure of conservation anywhere in the world. We see rewilding and I know Giles Davies is from Africa. He'll be speaking. We all learned this really through African models, that rewilding is an economic driver for local and regional communities. And we see this in almost everything we do, and we've lived it. And finally, I'll just leave you with this. Our old friend Arne Næss, the Norwegian philosopher, always said that all life has intrinsic value. We can't give them value. They own it. It is theirs to have. And that's really what guides everything we do. The 15 million acres, the however many species and so on. We always come back to that. Where are we going? And that is our North Star, the intrinsic value of all life. Thank you, Guido.
Thank you so much, Christine. Our second practitioner is Rebecca Wrigley. Rebecca is CEO of Rewilding Britain, where she's taking rewilding into mainstream conservation via a very successful rewilding network of landowners. And we love to hear from her. Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Guido, and thanks to everyone. It's great to be here and to be able to speak with you. It's a shame not to be able to see everyone's faces, but you know, that's the world we're living in at the moment. I'm just going to share my screen. A second. So I'm just going to give some thoughts about what we're doing in terms of achieving rewilding at scale through coordinated local action. So Rewilding Britain, we started 5 years ago. We're still small, and our role we see is as a catalyst for change for rewilding in practice, to influence particularly government policy, but also engage, so raise awareness of rewilding and help people to take actions to support rewilding. And I suppose a big question is what is rewilding? For us, we have 5 principles. So we start with people are part of nature. We're not apart from it. So we have to consider rewilding and people together, and we have to support people and nature together. We can't separate the two, and I think that's been a problem in the past. Rewilding is about working at nature's scale, but that scale can be achieved through large areas or interconnected smaller areas. And as an ideal, we'd love to see rewilding from people's doorstep, gardens into parks, into river corridors, out into the countryside. So it doesn't have to be scale in terms of large isolated areas. And in those areas, for me, one of the fundamental things is about letting nature lead. It's about reinstating natural processes rather than conserving specific species. And that might involve reintroductions of species where they're missing in the food web and in the trophic cascade, but also allowing natural disturbances that creates that functional complexity that is sort of rocket fuel for biodiversity. But as Chris said, that element of rewilding has to be hand in hand with people's livelihoods. So it can create huge opportunities in terms of nature-based economies, enterprises, forms of production. And obviously, we like to see the benefits secured in the long term. And those benefits, well, we see one of the huge kind of pluses and positive sides and hopeful sides of rewilding is that there are so many benefits. Firstly, rewilding can draw down carbon from the atmosphere, and we proved in a report last year that the extent of that could be equal to, in the UK, about 10% of our current emissions. So it could have a significant impact in climate mitigation. But also, it's a big week for us this week because we've relaunched our website. We've launched the first phase of the Rewilding Network that I'll talk about in a minute, but we've also just launched a report on the role of rewilding in climate adaptation and the fact that climate zones are now moving so fast northwards in the Northern Hemisphere, at least 5 kilometres a year, that rewilding can help create the kind of habitats and connectivity that allows species to disperse as they have to move because of climate change. Obviously, hand in hand with that, it reverses biodiversity loss, can support diversified, more resilient economies, but also, as Chris said in the film, it's the sort of bedrock of our health and well-being as humans. So because of all those things, because of the climate emergency, the ecological emergency, there's a growing realization that we need to act. We need to act now, and we need to have ambition in terms of the scale and pace of change. So at Rewilding Britain, we're starting now to call for 30% of Britain to be rewilding and in nature's recovery by 2030. That's the scale, at least, that we need to achieve. But we'd like to see that through connectivity, through creating what we're calling climate corridors, right from Cornwall to Caithness, up the spine of the country, down through our river systems and river corridors to the coast and round the sea. And of that 30%, we'd like to see at least 5% as core rewilding areas. So the highest level of rewilding on the rewilding spectrum, but also 25% at least of a kind of mosaic of nature enhancing land and marine uses, a sort of interconnected tapestry with stepping stones of core rewilding amongst other forms of land use like low impact silviculture, some forms of extensive grazing, nature-based tourism, of course. And at marine, we'd like to see our inshore and offshore waters truly protected. So what are we doing? Well, as Guido said, we're just launching a rewilding network. So we feel that change can happen from the bottom up, from a myriad of different initiatives where people are wanting to rewild. And we're constantly now getting requests. How do we rewild from sort of 2 acres to 20 acres to 1,000 acres, from private landowners to conservation NGOs to public landowners? And we feel that kind of creating that movement and supporting that movement and connecting it up, we'll start to see a sort of, a much bigger, we can kind of start it to be much more than the sum of its parts. And so just, I suppose whoops, wrong way, to round up a bit, I mean, then we see that there are real opportunities for rewilding. Again, starting with that coordinated, locally led action. It's a kind of decentralized approach where we're seeing an upsurge in interest in rewilding, both for ecological reasons, but also economic reasons. We feel our role is to help catalyze and support that movement for change and to support that myriad of initiatives that all will add up to large scale change. Of course, we also need joined up government action. So we'd like to see rewilding mainstream, just one of the ways, part of how we manage our land and seas. To do that, we need integrated financial and regulatory support. And I suppose one of the potential opportunities of Brexit in the UK is, for instance, changing the common agricultural policy and how we provide incentives for and support land use change. So the replacement for common agricultural policy, called the Environmental Land Management Scheme, has the potential to be quite positive in supporting public payment for public goods, which again, if we get that joined up, integrated approach to land use and marine use and an integrated support for that, I think we can achieve the change that we need. So I suppose that's all I wanted to say, and I really look forward to the discussion that follows.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. And wow, I love your program, and most of all, I love the ambitions of your Rewilding Britain organization. So good luck with that, and we love your new visual identity, by the way. So good luck with all that. Last but not least, our own Luis Martinez. Luis is our country program manager in Spain. Smart guy, great nature lover, and a driven rewilder. So Luis, I would say, take it away.
Thank you very much, Guido. That's a great pleasure to be here with all of you. I will try to express also our own view about what is rewilding. If I can find, wait a minute. So all of us gave us our own vision of rewilding, and of course, the Nature Foundation is not going to be the least. But I wanted to start a little bit from the beginning. Okay, so what was the origin of rewilding? Rewilding, really, the first time that the word rewilding appears publicated was in a paper written by Soule and Noss in 1998. They spoke about rewilding as the restoration and protection of big wilderness and wide-ranging large animals. They also spoke about a critical step in restoring self-regulating land communities. And that's the magical word for me, self-regulated. Because if we are talking about restoration nature, nature, by definition, must be independent, must be self-regulated. Because a lot of times we go to a natural park, to a national park, and you will hear, well, here we need to fire the grass to avoid the bushes or to cull the herbivores because there's so much, something like that. But well, if human beings need to regulate it, then for me, this is not nature, because nature must be self-sufficient. But of course, it's very difficult nowadays to get it. So how can we get this self-sufficient nature in the 21st centuries? Well, Soule and Noss express it quite well in the famous 3 Cs of rewilding, which were core areas, corridors between those areas, and carnivores, that today we speak about keystone species, which will run across those areas. Because this is only a natural evolution from the theory of island biogeography, which was written by MacArthur and Wilson in 1967. MacArthur and Wilson realized that little tiny islands, as you can see here in this graphic, little tiny isolated islands has a very high rates of extinction and very low biodiversity rate. But in bigger islands, or in Iceland, especially in Iceland, which has contact with different other islands, the extinction rates were lower and the number of species were higher. And it can be applied too for protection areas. So we want a self-regulating nature with species which can travel and move around, as Rebecca says, to avoid, for example, the global warming. You know, they need to move and they need to look for new places. They need also to boost the ecological system. You know, they need to start to work in the evolutionary system. But how can we get it in the 21st century? More or less, the ecological theory is all right. But we also need to develop in a very populated world. And for this, the True Nature Foundation is proposing also to include something else. Of course, will be the ecological restoration, the rewilding by itself with the keystone species, the corridors and the core areas, but also the rural development and the climate change. Why? Because the climate change, a healthy ecosystem can be a very good way of storing carbon in the subsoil. So it can help in the climate change. But also then, why do we need to include the rural development? Well, as Chris said, we need to rewild ourselves. And absolutely any conservation project never ever has worked in any place in the world if the local community were not agree with it. So what do we need to get it? Well, I'm sorry to say so or not, but to get it, we need to work with the local communities, to spend endless hours of talking and chatting and calling with the local communities, with all the stakeholders, the hunters, the farmers, the mayors, the gamekeepers, everyone. And we did a lot of time, you don't know it very well. We were doing it in Spain, in Romania, in Georgia, in a lot of countries, in a lot of places, during a lot of time. A lot of times it's very rewarding. And normally it's very funny, but sometimes always is very hard, because not everybody likes this kind of programs. And we need to make them understand that rewilding is not only good for climate change or for biodiversity, but it's also good for the communities, because we are offering them a sustainable way of developing their own communities with new job position on, for example, on ecotourism. So my recommendation for new rewilders, what is? Well, I'm sorry, but keep calm, practice rewilding, speak with everyone, because really, my friend, the greatest impediment to rewilding is the unwillingness to imagine it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Louis. Great talk. I love it. Sounds very familiar too, actually, but that hardly can be a surprise. We get some very interesting questions in from our audience. And I have 3 questions in front of me. And I suggest that we start putting them in. The first question I would like to address to Christine. And this is a question posed by Nina Schoenberg. What are the possible conflicts between actively restoring versus letting nature to regenerate on its own?
Well, it's a very good question.
Okay.
I think that with our experience, there are some cases where you can just leave it alone, and maybe it's an old estancia, a ranch, and the only thing you really have to do is take the livestock off and let in this case, the grasslands begin to reseed over different seasons and usually many years, and it can restore itself. But there are other areas where it's just not possible. You have to instigate the restoration. And I'm talking more about landscape now, but every area, every project is different. There isn't a recipe that you can really follow. It sometimes has to do with local politics. It has to do with national politics. Every circumstance is very different. So you have to be very flexible in the way that you go about restoring landscapes.
Thank you. Rebecca, would you like to comment on this question as well?
Yes, I mean, I completely agree with what Chris said. I mean, we started particularly, for instance, with we have a model where basically let nature take care of itself, if at all possible. There are circumstances where you'll need to kickstart that. For instance, with woodland regeneration, there might not be seeds. There are many places in Britain where there are no seed sources for trees, and so you might want to kickstart that through disturbing the ground. And you know, we kind of want to turn on the whole tree planting thing a little bit on its head, because in most places in Britain you don't need to plant trees unless there isn't a seed source, and then you can often do direct seeding or just remove herbivores for a while to let nature kind of take off. So I think I agree. In many cases, nature's very good at taking care of itself. It's been doing it for quite a long time without our help. Where it needs help, there are some interventions that you can take to kickstart it, and then, you know, if the ecosystem is completely degraded, it might need much more active mechanisms. But fundamentally, let's start by letting nature take care of itself.
Okay, thank you. A second question coming from Mr. Binyana. I'm actually not sure if it's a Mr., but Binyana Pasakala. And the question is, do rewilding projects increase human-wildlife interfaces, causing increase in conflicts? Chris, would you like to comment on this one?
Yeah, again, it really depends on the circumstances. yes, in southern Chile, especially where we have not reintroduced pumas or mountain lions, but they've been persecuted for the last almost century. So their numbers were very, very low in the southern cone and quite fragile. They're like lions in Africa. They're pursued because of the conflict with livestock. And really what we did is stopped in a very, very large area or a series of areas, the shooting of them, and they come back pretty rapidly on their own. And so, yes, you do have some livestock predation that may go up somewhat, and you do have a lot of people seeing pumas now, which they would not have done 15 years ago. There are a lot of programs that we've initiated on management of livestock, and I'm sure most everybody on this panel has had some experience with this, and trying to change livestock management forward toward that is more active, I should say. And while wildlife numbers go up, this does not have to mean that your livestock numbers go down. And so it's a lot more work. It's managing livestock the way they did hundreds of years ago before we have our modern techniques. But yes, there are more interactions between wildlife and human populations and livestock populations. But we consider that to be a good thing. And so with rewilding, you're not just bringing something back, you're trying to figure out how do you eliminate the causes that they went extinct in the first place? Because if you don't do that, or you're not prepared to do that, then you're just recreating yet another extirpation down the road someplace. So that's kind of how we see it.
Thank you. A bit of a similar question. There's an analogy, I think. It was posed by Chanel Whitting. And the question I'd like to address to Lewis this time. And I think it's very relevant for Spain as well as for so many other countries. But how can rewilding, for example, reintroducing large mammals and agriculture complement each other instead of conflicting?
Well, that's indeed a very good question, because, well, large mammals, as I said, they need a lot of space, of course, and they need to also to migrate, especially in countries like Spain, which the primary production is very dependent on the season. You know, we have a good production on spring and autumn, but on summer and winter is very low. So the animals have to move a lot. And it means, as Chris said, it's a source of conflict with the people, especially with the farmers. But it doesn't mean that it's completely impossible to do anything. What it means is that people have to change their mind. So we, the place where I'm developing my activity is not only mine. I must accept that a lot of things will go on there. For example, the migration of big mammals or birds or whatever. But I must understand that it can be a source of incomes, not only for me, but also for my community, because people will go there to see them, etc. Of course, I must be the only one who pay the protection of my culture, of my cattle, of my whatever. Well, in Europe, what is accepted, especially in the case of wolves, attacks of great carnivores to livestock, is that in the European Union is paying these losses to the farmers. Okay, so if a wolf eats your sheep, then the European Union will pay to you. The sheep, in this case, you will not lose very much. And also the European Union will help you to buy, for example, big dogs or electric fences or things like that. So the point is, this is going to increase the conflict. well, it will increase the conflict in a traditional way of farming, in a traditional way of doing things. If I want to release my animals and forget about them during 1 week, then for sure I'm going to have conflicts. But if we adapt to the new condition, if we ask the government for help and the rewilders, because that's why we are there also to help them and to give them solutions for this kind of problems, then I will get this kind of fence, the new dogs, the new systems, the new whatever options that I have to avoid this kind of conflicts.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Louis. Rebecca, would you like to comment on this as well, or another conflict, you know, or there could be different interests in play when we're talking hunting, for instance. Is that something you would like to comment on?
I mean, the context in Britain in terms of conflict, I mean, one thing is we've had no top predators in Britain for so long that people just aren't used to living alongside predators in the way that they might be in some parts of Europe and the US. So that creates an issue in itself, and our whole farming systems, like the way that we herd sheep, for instance, isn't used to the fact that there might be wolves or lynx in the woodlands. And our whole way of hunting in Britain is completely different as well. You know, we have practically farmed landscapes in our grouse moors and our deer stalking estates that are completely degraded of wildlife and biodiversity, but full of the animals that one might want to hunt. So there is conflict there. There's conflict with farmers in terms of conflict is not so much the word as I think the debate has been polarized up until now, partly because some farmers in the uplands in particular see it as a threat to their livelihood, to their cultural heritage, and to their way of farming the land. But I think there's more recently been a real shift and move towards finding common ground, because there is a significant amount of common ground between those who manage the land, between rewilders, between conservationists. It's about bringing everyone together and saying, what are we asking of the land and sea today and for the future, and how do we have to change the way that we manage the land and sea for the good of everyone? Okay,
thank you. We have still other interesting questions, but looking at the time, we have to move on. I'd like to announce now that we have our second Slido question. That is the poll question coming up. And the question is as follows, and we will come back to this question at the end of our session. The question is, how can we increase the impact and scale of rewilding efforts worldwide? So you see the screen now, the Slido screen. And by the way, we have about 500 attendees. So we'd love to get your input on this. It is quite obvious that we have to scale up our efforts in the next coming years. And if you look at the program of Rewilding Britain, for instance, again, I'm very happy with that ambition. And I hope, thanks to a Green Deal coming up and the plans of the European Commission, let's hope we can scale this up on a European level, at least in the European Union. So I would like, yes, you're reacting on that already very well. I'd like to give the word now to my good colleague, Marijke Brune, who will host the second part of our session with two fantastic funders of rewilding, one from the private end, being Conservation Capital, and the other from the public end, being Stephanie Lindenberg of the European Investment Bank. Please have my seat, and we'll be back.
Warm welcome, everyone, in the session today. We are extremely privileged to host also here the European Investment Bank and also Conservation Capital. I would like to present Stephanie Lindenberg from the Natural Capital Finance Facility, and Giles Davis, founder and CEO of the Conservation Capital, managing impressive projects in Africa and in Europe as well. So please, Stephanie, can I ask you to take the floor?
Yes, hello everyone. Can you see me? Yes. Thank you very much, Marijke, for the introduction. I would also like to share a couple of slides with you. Let me just bring them up. Can you see my slides?
Yes, it's very clear from
Right,
here.
can you? Yes, perfect. Okay, thank you very much. So I'm very humbled to be on this panel with such very impressive practitioners, and I will speak about a slightly more dull project about financing rewilding, especially from our perspective, from the perspective of the institution I work for, from the European Investment Bank. And I want to speak about a product that we have which allows financing rewilding projects. It's called Natural Capital Finance Facility. And then I want to throw in a couple of ideas on how we can scale up financing for rewilding projects. And as I said, we have one product in particular. It's called the Natural Capital Finance Facility, which allows financing projects which promote biodiversity and rewilding projects. But before I speak about this product or give you a bit of an insight on this, I would like to say a few words on the institution I work for. It's called the European Investment Bank. We call ourselves the EU Bank. Our shareholders, our owners are the EU member states. And our mandate is to implement EU policies. Traditionally, we have been financing a lot of large infrastructure, and therefore the Natural Capital Finance Facility is a bit of an outlier and also new for us. So let me talk a bit about this, let's call it financial product that we have. As I said, the idea of this product is to finance projects in Europe that promote biodiversity. And I give you the key facts about it. It's a financial instrument that was set up by the European Investment Bank and the European Commission. We provide debt and equity. So we can provide loans or we can contribute to a fund. And we have another component in this product, which is technical assistance. And this is grant-based. So we have two components, really. One is repayable finance. And I emphasize that because it's often a misunderstanding. So we offer finance, but it has to be paid back. And the other one is a grant-based component, technical assistance to support the projects in the development, which does not have to finance to be paid back. The instrument is currently in a pilot phase that runs until 2021, but I'm sure that there will be something following this instrument that can then also finance such projects. We can finance projects which have to have a minimum size or need at least 5 million and a maximum of 15 million. We can provide loans, as I said, directly to a project or to a national bank that then can on-lend, and then we can participate in funds. We can never finance 100% of a project. We can only finance a maximum of 75% of a project. We can finance private entities, commercial entities, NGOs, or public entities, like, for example, a municipality. And then again, we have the technical assistance component with which we can support each project with up to 1 million grant financing. And the idea is really that these projects are relatively new. They need support in the development, in the setting up. So we can support them in a wide range of aspects, reaching from advice on legal aspects, on commercial aspects, on technical aspects, on questions monitoring the impacts of the investments that are made. And now I would like to give you just a few examples of what of the projects we have financed so far. And the project that comes really closest to what we are speaking of today, Rewilding, is a loan to Rewilding Europe Capital. It's a microfinance institution which was set up by the NGO Rewilding Europe. Many of you might know them, or some of them might be on listening today. And the NGO has, I think, 9 regions across Europe in which they work together with so-called nature-focused businesses. And these businesses work with nature, and a share of their income goes towards the conservation of the areas they're working in and from which they benefit and base their businesses on. And it's everyone who doesn't know it, I really recommend visiting their website and having a look. It's a great project. But we also have other projects. For example, we have financed a forestry fund in Ireland, which moves from the clear felling method to continuous covers forestry, and introducing a number of other aspects to maximize biodiversity in Irish forests. Mm-hmm. We have also, and I chosen this, a project where we on-lend to a national bank in Croatia, and they lend to nature-based businesses, ecotourism businesses, businesses that use natural or produce some kind of natural products. And we have done that because this allows the bank in Croatia to on-lend smaller amounts than we are able to lend. So far to what we have done so far, what the NCFF is. Please don't hesitate to ask any questions if this was too quick. On rewilding, we would love to finance more rewilding projects, and we would like to see more rewilding projects come to us. And but they have their peculiarity and their special characteristics, and I would just like to speak about a few, not too long, and then about from these characteristics, I would like to move on to what I think we need to do to scale up the financing in this area. From a project perspective, what does rewilding mean? I mean, we have heard a lot, what does rewilding mean? But it means, from activities, cost items, it means, for example, removing old infrastructure like dikes or dams, as we see here on the left. It means reintroducing species. But in particular, it means letting nature take over to itself. And for that, we need land. We need to purchase land, or we need to acquire the rights to land. And this is something that, for example, my institution, we cannot purchase land. It's in our statutes, we cannot do it. However, we can finance the removal of infrastructure, reintroduction of species. And then, of course, we need some businesses around rewilding. As many of you already said, I think it was Rebecca, we need to think how nature and people can work together. Because we also need someone who repays those investments that we are financing. Because, as I said before, we are not a philanthropic institution. We are not providing grants like the European Commission or other public entities. We are providing repayable financing. So we need businesses, and they have the difficult task to generate revenues for themselves, but also for the investments that were made into rewilding, if you want to bring them into the equation. So from my side and from my view as a funder, what needs to be done, or the path really to scaling up, is we need to work together as funders. We all have different strengths. We have different strings attached to our financing. As I said, we can never finance 100% of a project. We can, for example, not finance land at the moment. We can finance almost everything else. This means we can finance activities which are, however, not very cost intensive. Therefore, we need to work together with entities on the ground who can aggregate those projects, who bring a lot of these projects to us so that we can make a financeable project out of it. We need entities who have people in there with financial know-how. Often the projects that come to us we meet people who are excellent conservation experts, biologists who are very passionate about their projects, but they lack the financial know-how. And then there is a friction between those entities who come to us, and because we don't speak the same language. So we need within the institutions or the entities working on the ground, people who are financially literate and to know how to deal with a bank and who know how to take on financing. And then, of course, we need finally more businesses who have nature as a focus and who want to work, who want to contribute to rewilding and make a living from this. And finally, of course, we need the conservation experts who tell us what to do. But what I would really like to stress, what I think is missing at the moment, is entities on the ground who are aggregating these projects and bring projects to us that have the right size for us and other financiers, and to bring in financial experts, people who are financially literate, into the people who are doing the great work on the ground and developing the rewilding projects, so that we both speak the same language and can set up projects that can be financed by our institution and other institutions or financiers.
Wonderful.
That's it from my side, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. I've got a lot of questions coming up, but since we have a small time challenge, I would like to give the floor to Gilles. Ciao. Sorry, I pronounced your name wrongly. Thank you so much. Giles, please.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think the host needs to enable me to start my video. There we go. Thank you, Marika, and good evening, everyone, from a very wet position on the equator in Kenya. But the arrival of the rains is always a welcome thing in this part of Africa. Mm-hmm. I'm going to talk a little bit about just a few issues relevant to financing rewilding. I don't have time here to go through all the different types of mechanisms, so I'll just pick out a few themes. On this slide, I hope you can all see it, there is indeed a list of the different types of mechanisms that you might be able to use to finance rewilding. Grants, philanthropy, endowments, through to green taxes, debt for nature swaps, payment for ecosystem services, bonds, impact investing, enterprise mechanisms, or even outcome-based financing. They all have their own characteristics. They're all tools that should be considered by any rewilding practitioner. But just one thing I want to draw out from that is that any rewilding practitioner, when they're thinking about financing for rewilding projects, should draw some distinctions. They should draw some distinctions between mechanisms which are pure financing mechanisms, those which are essentially involve collating capital into a pot to be used for a particular purpose. That examples would be endowments in the not-for-profit space, conservation bonds in the for-profit space, conservation trust funds, impact funds, etc., etc. So the creation of a capital pot is one thing that people should be thinking about, and that should be distinctive from revenue mechanisms. Revenue mechanisms might be things like payment for ecosystem services, or biodiversity offsets, carbon offsets, or user fees, where it's more about creating an annuity stream, a continual flow of revenue that can support rewilding activity. And then finally, enterprise or commercial enterprise mechanisms, and we've heard a bit about that already. Enterprises themselves might be a generator of revenue. They might be a target for financing from these financing mechanisms, but they can also have sort of non-pure financing effects. They can be used to create incentives for local communities, particularly if they're nature-based, to facilitate or support rewilding, and they may even just operate in a way that facilitates rewilding, using processes or technologies which reduce pressure on natural landscapes, for example. So I think when you're thinking about the firmament of options in financing, try to draw a distinction between pure financing mechanisms versus revenue mechanisms versus the use of nature-based enterprise to support rewilding endeavor. just going back to this table, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but what I've tried to do here is assess to what extent these different types of mechanism tend to be more suited to public finance versus being more suited to private finance. And they all have different dynamics in this regard. But I think the key point that I want to draw out from here is that most of them have the opportunity for combinations of both. And I think if rewilding and the financing of rewilding, and clearly money and rewilding are pretty key, or is a key constraint or key opportunity, you really need a partnership, or there's a lot of opportunity rather for partnerships between public sources of financing and private sources of financing. You often hear now about public-private partnerships in many aspects of life, including conservation or rewilding, but we should also be thinking about public-private financing partnerships as well. Something kind of linked to that is the whole issue of blended finance. Again, you don't need to think about grant finance entirely separately from an investment fund, the kind of capital that Stephanie would provide. You can often mix the two to create mutually supportive opportunities in financing.
Okay, thank you so much.
So I'm not quite complete. Just one second, Marika. Just a couple of other quick slides. Rebecca had a slide that said, what is rewilding? And the definition of rewilding is pretty key to financing. You tend to get, in rewilding context, quite purist definitions, which will involve a greater degree of social and economic exclusion from a rewilding area, to perhaps might be what might be termed more pragmatic definitions, where you have a higher degree or even a high degree of social and economic integration into a rewilding context. I guess the point of this slide is really just to say that if you're looking at those very pure or core rewilding definitions, there will definitely be scope for financing, but it's perhaps more limited than in the more pragmatic context. So this line here doesn't start at the bottom, it starts halfway up. But the more pragmatic, the more you're able to introduce the idea of nature-based businesses, you're able to use, allow either businesses or people to access rewilding areas. You start to bring into play more commercial opportunities for financing, conservation bonds, impact investment funds, user fees, et cetera, et cetera. So the definition of rewilding in any particular rewilding context will be a determinant to some extent about the amount of financing optionality that practitioners have. Just one final slide, Marika, if I may, is I often wonder about the distinction between conservation and rewilding. I was brought up and operate mainly in Africa, where I tend to think of myself as a conservationist, but I've had the great good fortune to work with rewilding Europe, primarily on the European continent, and was quite intimately involved in the establishment of Rewilding Europe Capital, which Stephanie said earlier on. We've also had the privilege of working with Rebecca in Britain. I think conservation as a whole tends to be more about defending value. Rewilding may be thought about more about rebuilding value. To some extent, that's a bit generalist, but conservation tends to be a more of a developing nation focused discipline versus developed nation discipline for rewilding. And conservation is perhaps an older discipline. I mean, obviously they're very, very closely linked. But I think that practitioners of rewilding, and particularly when it comes to financing, and particularly commercial financing or for profit, where you have to pay the money back, as Stephanie said, it's one of the perhaps rare areas where the developed world and where rewilding is more prevalent can really learn from the developing nations, where I think we've had to do this for longer, perhaps in more challenging context, and develop some pretty creative methodologies for that. So we should be sharing a lot of lessons when it comes to rewilding across the conservation and rewilding space. I'll stop just finally to really emphasize, I don't have a slide on this, but a couple of points that Stephanie made. It's very difficult to raise finance at scale for small individual projects. And so any organization, and Rewilding Europe Capital tried to do this, or is doing this, as I think Stephanie's slide said, there's now 30 projects there. You need to aggregate projects so that you can target larger amounts of finance from single sources. You need to be very, very conscious of risk. Financiers like Stephanie are very risk conscious. That's the whole way private sector finance has learned to be so efficient. And then the issue of financial literacy is a really key point, again, that came up in the prior presentation. Practitioners need to learn to present projects and present value propositions in ways that financiers and banks are comfortable with. So I really just echo Stephanie's points in some of those dynamics that she raised on her final slide. I'll stop there, Marika.
Thank you so much, Giles. It was very interesting for both of you to present to us those innovative financing instruments. And I'm sure that we will take that further in the next couple of months. It's extremely interesting that you present and urged the parties that are working with Rewilding that they are forced to present commercially viable business cases, and that we move away from philanthropy, from grants, of course, always in combination, but it's fantastic that both in public and private sector, there are so many new instruments coming up to finance rewilding biodiversity. Fantastic, thank you so much. I had a question to Stephanie. I was wondering, does the bank work in, like, say, procurement rounds, or is it also possible to submit, let's say, business proposals during the year? Or are you working with a fixed agenda of procurement rounds?
No, you can submit a project at any time of the year. There are no fixed rounds like you see it, for example, with the European Commission for life grant funding. Just one comparison. No, so the answer is you can submit a project at any time of the year that you would like, and we are happy to receive your proposals. Okay,
and do you use specific impact standards for measurement impact in the area of rewilding or in conservation? How does the bank cope with those challenges?
Whether we use a specific, sorry, I didn't get you
do you use specific, like, balanced scorecards or measurement modules for measuring impact on specific product proposals?
No.
Into, let's say,
no, we really, this is up, sorry. This is up to each project to make a proposal how they want to measure the impact. And we follow most of the time their proposal. Okay, thank you very much. I have got two interesting questions from the audience. Thank you so much for that. One is from Bas Knoll. How can rewilding be financed, and what is in there, both financially and non-financially? Giles, can I pass this question to you?
Sorry, Marika, could you just repeat that question? I didn't quite hear it. My apologies.
How can rewilding be financed, and what is in there, both financially and non-financially? It's more a general question, I think, and you touched upon that in your slide.
Yeah, I get, if I understand the question rightly, in terms of how can rewilding be financed, I would say that from my perspective, our experience is more from the is more on the kind of commercial financing side, as opposed to grants and philanthropy, which, by the way, are super important in their own context, particularly for those purer sort of definitions of rewilding. But it's about, in a world where, well, certainly in the developing world, but where, you know, there's more and more human impact, more and more people. You know, I think that rewilding has to adopt that more integrationist approach, look at ways of embracing the presence of nature-based businesses and enterprises to, you know, in rewilding context, to support rewilding context. And the more you bring in profitable businesses, the more you open up opportunities for non-grant based finance to play a role, and as many people on this call will know, we face a chronic shortage of funding for conservation or rewilding overall. It's between $1 billion and a couple of $1 billion a day in terms of the shortfall. And that's never going to be bridged by traditional grants or sources or philanthropy. But so our view would be that commercial finance needs to play a bigger role, and we would, I think it's necessary. Listen, we all love pure wildernesses, all of us. But it may not always be practically possible, and you may need to bring in tourism. You may need to bring in sustainable agriculture. You may need to build in sustainable sources of energy, commercialize those. And once you do that, if those businesses operate in a way which is good for nature rather than bad for nature, and they can be if they're not structured properly, you open up a whole new world of financing. So I hope I've interpreted the question right, but that would be one of my main mechanisms, and that's why Rewilding Europe, which did and does a lot of what I call very pure rewilding, species introduction, land acquisition, or securitizing land. But that's why Rewilding Europe Capital was developed, and it's an exciting evolution, and it brings in the European Investment Bank as a financing partner. That would not have been possible without that more economically integrationist approach.
Yes, I fully agree. It's absolutely crucial to develop this sector and contribute to that. Thank you so much, Charles. I've got a question for Stephanie, actually. Well, two people posed more or less the same question, Christine and Andrea Salcedo. I hope I pronounced this correctly. Stephanie, what returns do you look for? Are there certain criteria that you use to select, for example, investments? What are your standard criteria? What is the bank's standard model to evaluate business proposals? Can you elaborate?
First of all, I have to say I'm not on the operational, on the financing side myself. I'm more on the technical side of the project. So and we do not have a standard that we would ask as a return. It really depends on many different aspects of how the project is set up and how also the trust we have in the entity we work with. So there's no standard rate of return that I could mention here that we would expect.
Okay, thank you so much. Then there is another question, I think for Rebecca, by Christine Radcliffe. She loved your presentation, and she asked whether you see a role for private sector, particularly private finance and investments. Rebecca, are you there yet?
Yes, I'm here. Absolutely. I mean, I agree with Giles in that we need to take a pragmatic approach, and there's a place to play for everyone, for the corporate sector, for the private landowners, for public landowners, and we need. I think what's key is that we need to take an integrated kind of approach to land use, develop land use strategies on large scales and then increasingly regional and local scales, so that we take coordinated action and don't think about land as in here we do farming, here we do forestry, here we do fishing, bit of tourism over there. But how can we look at an area and define what's the, again, what are we asking of the land and sea, and how do we best use the resources that we have to produce food, to enhance nature biodiversity, and then the financing mechanisms need to come in on that. So we take a coordinated approach, because at the moment I think we've got a scattergun approach, and certain activities are supported through certain funding mechanisms, and other activities through others, and they're not mutually supportive.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, once again, Stephanie and Giles, thank you so much for your valuable contribution to our session. I could talk for hours on this, because it's highly impressive what you have developed and how you can boost the nice and impressive initiatives further. I would like to take the floor to Guido again. Thank you so much, and we move on to the next part. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. There we are again. I know in Corona time we're not supposed to sit this close together, but I tell you one thing: True Nature Foundation is a family. So, and I understand our regulators said we can do so as long as you're a family unit. Anyhow, we're coming to the last bit of our session, and it is way too short. I mean, it's very clear, and we have a lot of questions unanswered from the public, which is a pity. They are registered, and we can follow up in a written way on your questions, and we will liaise with our speakers on that, so that all questions get an answer. I mean, that would be something we'd like to do. What we want to do in the last 15 minutes of the session we have now is to bring everyone, practitioners and funders of rewilding, together, and around one key question, and that is how, as you answer that question to some extent already for your beautiful island, Rebecca, how can we worldwide scale up rewilding projects over the next 10 years, and how do we increase the impact of these projects together? And I think it has to come from both ends, and some remarks were made already in this regard. But how can we scale up and increase our impact over the next 10 years on rewilding, both from a financial and a funder's point of view, as well as the practitioners' end? So I would like to ask all speakers to address this question, starting with you, Christina. Are you still there?
Yes, of course.
Yes, you're holding out. Excellent. So happy to have you back. So you understand the question, I suppose, huh? No.
Yeah, I do.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Speaking as a funder for our own projects, and also a recipient of partnerships, institutional and individual, and I would say this: to you, as you say, you have to start at both ends. So, though imperfect, the Endangered Species Act in the United States requires that there is a higher level of protection for the species on that list, and there are funds to help bring back populations where it's feasible. So at a national level, a sovereign state, you have to have the kind of laws and regulations that support this kind of work. Even though you may not be attached to that on a daily basis, you still have to have it. Because you're looking at rewilding in 50, 100, 200 years out, and that's the institutional power. Yeah. And then you have to have on the ground, you have to have teams and yourselves very, very committed to the long-term project that is rewilding.
Very true.
I think one of the simplest things we do is to actually acquire land. Some cases you buy it and you sign the check and you've got the land, but that's the easiest thing anyone does. The rewilding of a place, as I said earlier, requires the territory to do it in that is stable and protected. It requires ourselves to rewild ourselves as individuals and communities. And it has to be wide scale. To your question, it has to be a shared sense of national global patrimony, and then bring it very, very rapidly down to the local level, that for economic reasons, for reasons of pride and community dignity and all sorts of reasons, those things have to be present to achieve successes long-term in terms of rewilding, in my opinion.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Rebecca, I'm sure you have some ideas on this topic as well.
I mean, I don't have an awful lot to add in terms of, and I completely agree with Chris. It's a combination of kind of government-led action, and we can influence government because supposedly they're acting on our behalf, plus coordinated locally led action, built through, you know, a movement for change. And we have, I mean, one thing we haven't mentioned in the last hour or a bit is the COVID pandemic. You know, in light of that, we cannot let it happen in vain. There's a huge upsurge in interest and desire to address the climate and ecological emergencies, partly because of COVID and the way that we know that one of the factors in causing it was the relationship we have with the natural world. So I think we have to, as citizens and individuals, ensure that the massive amounts of investment that is going to happen post-COVID to, you know, kickstart economies happens in a way, you know, it's a green recovery, and it is a nature positive and climate positive recovery. So that would be my plea, I think.
Okay, thank you. Lewis, you got any thoughts on this topic?
Well, can you hear me? Yes, I'm here. Well, yes. What can we do to increase the impact of rewilding? Well, Chris was talking about about working with the communities and so, and Rebecca spoke about the government, and all of this is true. But how can we push forward these communities and governments to get this? For me, the key right now is to make the people understand what are we doing now and what are our achievements. You know, 10 years ago, nobody was speaking about rewilding, and even when it's a much older concept. But now everybody's talking, and then there's a great momentum about rewilding. People is talking about this, and so. And as you told me a lot of times, dear Guido, once the ship gets in the dike, all the rest of the ships will follow her. You know, if we make good rewilding projects, and I'm a great fan of the Chris work. I'm following her work from some years ago, and other rewilding projects that are, for example, in England. And I think that there's that those are great projects because it brings richness to the communities, improves the environment, get CO2 trapped in the soil, and gets a lot of those benefits. But the people doesn't know it. We need to be sure that the people know what are we doing and what is rewild. And for this we must show the good results of the current projects that are doing all around the world. And I'm completely sure that once the people know it, exactly the same as you and I, and most of the people who are hearing us right now, the people will realize that this is a positive topic, not only for the environment and the climate change, but also for human beings.
Just one practical question. So actually you say we need the media to convey the messages we'd like to get out on rewilding. How do we do that? I think Christine has you run projects who are really mind-blowing, you know, so I notice, I find your story everywhere, and I'm happy. I'm very happy with that. I mean, you're promoting not only your own projects with it, but the whole concept of rewilding at the same time. So I think we really need champions, and in my eyes, you are a champion of rewilding. Are there any other ways we can involve the media and get our stories and our message out, and about the necessity of the scaling up of our projects. Anyone would like to comment on that?
I will. I think the media is hungry for these stories.
Mm-hmm.
I can't think of any place around the globe where when we wanted to get a story out about a specific problem or success with a particular project or the concept of rewilding, looking at it broadly, I think they're dying for this kind of content because the optics of them are extraordinary, and the stories involve local heroes and villains and projects that have been incredibly frustrating and costly, but finally, you know, it's like the end of a good love story. It works out. I think that people working in rewilding, we see press and films and all sorts of things as part of the work. We don't distinguish between, I hate the word marketing, I'll just call it communication, and the work itself. Because exactly to Luis's point, we have to sell, and I know people don't like that word, but it's selling the experiences and the value of what success can look like for everybody.
Yes.
And humans and non-humans. So it's there. You don't have to reach very far before you have the kind of exposure that you might not have imagined possible beforehand.
Okay, thank you. We get great questions in, so I hope, we only have 5 minutes left. That's a pity. Sorry for the both funders, because there were some questions for you too. I hope we can take those questions in the aftermath and on a written basis. But there is one very nice question. I think we will all like that one, and that is, what have you done to rewild yourselves? And so it's a question of Jessica Ball of the Global Landscape Forum itself. I think it's a great question again. Jessica, thank you for that. And we have all about 30 seconds to address that question. But let's make it a great firecracker on the end. So, Christy, again, you have 30 seconds. What did you do to rewild yourself?
I left my business career and dedicated myself to, and my husband, living in isolated, very wild places. And then you begin to understand the language and the daily flow of what it means to be in the middle of someplace really wild. And for me, that's what it took. And now there's no going back. I can't imagine
Thank you.
having a life that's any different than the one I've got now.
Okay, excellent, great. Rebecca, what would be your answer? What did you do to rewild yourself?
I suppose the answer is, like many people, I seek every opportunity that I can, despite the fact that I live in a semi-urban area and within the constraints of having a small child, to have experiences of nature and experience the profound impact that that can have. And so, for example, the last thing that pops into my mind was off the west coast of Scotland, snorkeling with basking sharks. So yeah, seeking those experiences in wild nature, even if it's that or watching the red kites wheel above my house, it lifts the heart.
Great, thank you. Louis, just very short, because otherwise we have 2 more guests to couple, and we have 3 minutes left. Very brief. What makes you? What do you do to rewild yourself? I know the answer.
On the end, I think when I was 5 years old, my father found me making animals with plasticine, and I was ordering them according to the ecosystem, you know. So I think I was never very tame. But to rewild, well, I have been following you during almost 10 years now, and contributing with as much as I can to do it. And now that I have a son, I'm trying him to be also a little piece of wild in my own life.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Of course, then Giles, please. Oh, no, wait. Sorry, Giles. It's ladies first. Stephanie. Stephanie, what would you do to rewild yourself? Or your bank?
No, I personally go as often as I can to the Alps to go hiking, and I'm thirsty for it for the rest of the year when I can't go there. And if I can't go there, I go into the forest behind my house, even if it's not spectacular. I think it's a small piece of a bit of rewilding, and that's what I do, and I feel happy if I go there.
This picture of you from the beautiful Alps somewhere, and I thought, yeah, that's a great picture. Especially for someone running the capital finance facility. Yeah. Last, Giles, for you the honor to close the session. You have 1 minute. What do you do to rewild yourself?
Yeah, Guido. Well, right now I'm quite worried because I've been on this call for an hour and a half and I haven't got the dogs in, and there's a considerable risk of them getting eaten by a leopard. So I live in the middle of nature. I can hear hyenas calling. I can hear an owl calling. I'm not in anywhere near Chris's league, but I too took off a suit quite early on in my life and dedicated my entire life to working with nature. And then Louis mentioned his children. My eldest boy is quite good at sciences, and it was an easy conversation, but he's dropped mainstream scientists to study environmental systems and societies at IB. And I think that's all part of everyone, and particularly the youth, starting to rewild themselves, because we can talk about legislation, governments, money, but unless it came up a lot on this, unless we rewild ourselves at different levels, we're not going to get where we need to be.
Right. Okay. Well, everyone, all speakers, I thank you from the bottom of our heart. I think we had a great discussion, and it only takes two more. I mean, this is a literal translation of Dutch, but I hope you get what I try to say. I would like to continue one way or another this discussion, both between practitioners and funders, and amongst funders and practitioners. We'll see how we can follow up on this. Right for now, thank you so much for joining us. It was a privilege and an honor to have you in this session, and thank you to the public for attending this one. I think, and I'm looking at my colleague here, if we have a Slido outcome on the question. No, unfortunately not. We will share that in a written way. Thank you once again, and hope to see you next time. Bye bye now from the Netherlands and True Nature Foundation.
Hello everyone, greetings from Rio. My name is Bernardo Strasbourg, and it is a pleasure to be part of the Global Landscapes Forum again. I'd like to talk about ecosystem restoration. A couple weeks ago, we published a paper in Nature called the Global Priority Areas for Ecosystem Restoration. We developed and applied a spatial planning framework, Plangeia, to identify priority areas for restoration, aiming at maximizing benefits for biodiversity conservation and climate change mitigation, while keeping implementation costs and potential conflicts with agriculture to a minimum. We learned that restoring 30% of converted lands in priority areas can avoid up to 72% of expected species extinctions, while sequestering up to 465 billion tons of CO2. Crucially, we found that restoring priority areas can make restoration 13 times more cost-effective. We look at all ecosystem types globally. Predictably, forests do play a major role. But we found that if we're aiming at multiple benefits, as we probably should, all types of ecosystems have a role to play. Wetlands, for instance, are even more important than forests for these goals. Another key result is that if we improve the way we manage land, we can conserve all remaining natural areas and achieve very ambitious restoration levels without impacting food production. Now, from my experience in following restoration projects on the ground, in particular through the Atlantic Forest Pact, I know there are multiple challenges for implementation. But I have also seen that when people get together, and that's local people, policy people, NGO people, science people, business people, there's no problem we can't solve. I also learned from applying our approach from farm to global scales for governments, investors, and local stakeholder groups, how priorities can and should change according to the local context. It is therefore paramount that we include the preference of all these stakeholders in the restoration plans, taking special care to the most vulnerable ones. One last finding from our study are the massive synergies among the benefits for people, climate, and land conservation and biodiversity, but that we can only capture these synergies if we plan for them from the start. I hope the upcoming landmark conference of the Rio Conventions at the start of the first year of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration can help to realize this potential, as envisioned by all nations on Earth here in my hometown in 1992. Thank you.
Here's a story never told before. One about the biggest Pan-African landscape restoration project. A story about 30 African countries that pledged to restore more than 125 million hectares of land in the coming decade. A new perspective on regreening the mother continent. An ambitious tale told through an inspiring visual poem, tantalizing all human senses, reviving our hopes, and expanding the notion of what you think our planet and its people are capable of. AFR 100 presents the Grand African Green-Up.
jumlah nanas ada 10.000 nanas. Kami mengerjakan dalam 5 hari. Untuk kedepannya kami bisa untuk melanjutkan nanam nanasnya. Berapa hasilnya kami lanjutkan lagi.
Menanam dan membersihkan lahan-lahan ini. Harapan kami ingin penanam seperti Nenah ini berhasil dan berbuah banyak gitu. Saya senang menanam Nenah ini karena saya berpikir nanti akan mendapat hasil yang banyak.
Ada 2 alternatif yang sudah kita bicarakan bersama dengan kelompok tani dan masyarakat di sini. Yang pertama, apakah memilih dengan penggunaan alat berat seperti yang lazim dilakukan oleh perusahaan-perusahaan besar, ataukah dengan sistem tebas? Karena penggunaan alat berat selama ini itu menimbulkan kerusakan pada tanah gambut. Gambut yang sudah dikupas dengan menggunakan alat berat, biomasanya akan dibawa keluar dari bidang area tanaman, sehingga pertumbuhan tanaman di lahan yang bersangkutan nantinya akan kekurangan bahan organik justru. Oleh karena itu kita menggunakan cara yang lebih ramah, yaitu dengan cara manual ditebas pakai parang.
Many working on research without a clear implementation, without clear impact. So I think it's good if research combine immediately with action. So don't go to the field for 2 years for collecting data, but you miss the immediate action. It's one thing. And the other extreme is development. So you do many things on the ground, like a canal blocking, like a planting many things, but you are not encouraged, committed to be researcher. It means to learn from things that you develop, because in order to sustain, we need to improve the capacity of the committee, as well as to get science and technology from the development. So how then to fill the gap between traditional research and development? And the answer is participatory action research. This is the uniqueness what we have been doing so far in Dompas fields.
We are deeply involved in capacity building programs in Asia, and in particular this is one of about 50 programs that we have in Indonesia, and something that's unique to us working on a project such as this, where we support a capacity building program in the area of fire prevention. And we hope that the communities in the Dompas area could benefit from cleaner air in the long run with this collaboration between Temasek Foundation International as well as C4 and SCE.
These are wild elephants spotted in the remaining peat swamp forests of South Sumatra. Reaching back as far as the 7th century AD, humans and elephants have a long history, starting with the kingdom of Srivijaya. Sri Indravarman introduced himself as the king who had 1,000 elephants to the chief Muslim civil and religious ruler Caliph Umar bin Abdulaziz. Since the 1980s, there have been human-animal conflict. A national transmigration program relocated migrants into the elephant's home range. Many forests were cleared, turned into open fields, and timber was extracted. Landscape changes stranded Sumatran elephant populations on pockets of land. Once they roamed free in the region, moving between forest and the shore. stretching from Palembang to the east coast of Sumatra. Now they are restricted inland by the plantations and residential areas. Environmental issues in the wetlands continue to be increasingly complex, including the infamous forest fires that continue to occur across Sumatra. The impact is also felt by elephants. Padang Sugihan Sibukor Wildlife Reserve is the only conservation area in South Sumatra. If more areas were declared conservation areas, the elephants' natural habitat could be restored and the elephants could access their old routes back to the waters. No less important is how the surrounding communities can benefit from conservation.
Kami mengharapkan itu bagaimana masyarakat dan gajah dan juga hutan itu beradaptasi. Gajah dan juga masyarakat itu saling membutuhkan. Gajah juga membutuhkan lahan dan membutuhkan perlindungan, juga manusia juga butuh lahan dan juga butuh perlindungan dari hasil hutan. Kan selama ini gajah itu sudah beratus-ratus tahun di sini. Memang dari dulu memang gajah itu memang habitatnya ada di sini gitu kan. Kami kalau musnah, kami pun nggak rela juga kalau gajah itu habis begitu saja gitu.
A possible solution to the problem can be found in the restoration of the buffer zone between the conservation area and the community land.
Dalam melihat ini, CIFOR mencoba bagaimana untuk dapat menjawab 3 permasalahan besar yang pada saat ini kita diskusikan pada tataran global, yaitu makanan, energi, dan lingkungan. Untuk itu kita mencoba bagaimana caranya untuk dapat menanam tanaman bioenergi dengan juga mengkombinasikan dengan tanaman pangan untuk merestorasi lingkungan pada ekosistem yang terdegradasi berat.
Taman Nasional Gunung Halimun Salak terdiri dari 2 ekosistem, yaitu ekosistem Halimun dan ekosistem Salak.
pH-nya itu antara 4 sampai 6, itu cocok sekali untuk teh.
Di sini tanahnya emang bagus untuk dipakai tanaman gitu, air juga bagus.
One of the most strategic factory of aqua is in Gunung Salak.
Kami tinggal dan hidup di atas pegunungan, di tengah hutan.
Landscapes mean many things to many people. In the past, these different aspects of a landscape have been managed in isolation. But a shift is happening. Conservation organisations, development groups, companies and governments working in the same area are starting to reach out to each other to tackle problems together.
So a landscape approach is essentially managing complex landscapes in an integrated fashion and a holistic fashion, incorporating all of the different land uses within those landscapes into a single management process.
We need a landscape approach because there are many different uses of our land and our natural resources, and we need to balance these.
This is Gunung Halimun Salak National Park. Considering we're close to one of the mega cities of the world, Jakarta, it's an amazing repository of the last areas of biodiversity of the area. But more crucially, this landscape provides a very important catchment for watersheds and provides most of the water for the entire Jakarta Basin.
Javan leopards and gibbons still thrive here, but the park is no remote wilderness. It's located in Indonesia's most populous province and is surrounded by agriculture, plantations, cities and industry.
Sebenarnya ada salah satu persepsi bahwa konservasi itu adalah hanya untuk menjaga hutan, satwa. Kami katakan sangat tidak mungkin. Artinya kalau hanya berpikir ke arah situ. Dan sudah otomatis kita harus mengakomodir yang namanya kebutuhan hidup.
Hutan ini bagi bisnis, ya istilahnya saya dan keluarga saya yang ada di sini ya sangat penting sekali dengan adanya. Tapi kalau tanpa adanya hutan ini kemungkinan juga turis itu nggak bakalan banyak yang datang ke sini gitu.
The homestays provide income for a few, but most of the communities living in or near the park make their living from agriculture, farming or working on the area's famous tea plantations. Just over the ridge, the Kasepuhan traditional community practice rice agriculture.
Sebagai keseharian, sebagai titipan, sebagai adat yang harus dilakukan oleh masyarakat adat Banten Kidul. Menanam padi 1 tahun 1 kali.
This landscape attracts industries too. Global company Danone Aqua bottles 5 billion litres of water each year in Indonesia. 15% of that comes from the slopes of Mount Salak.
Today the quality of the water is very, very good. So this is really protected by the mountain and the forest and the Gunung Salak.
Aqua is one of many companies and organisations engaging with the national park in various conservation and development initiatives, starting the kinds of conversations that are essential for an integrated landscape approach. Of course, it doesn't always go smoothly.
Juga tidak bisa dikatakan bagus kalau terlalu menekan kebutuhan masyarakat. Misalnya dengan tidak membolehkan masyarakat menebang untuk kebutuhannya sendiri.
Nah, tantangannya tetap pasti ada karena sampai pada saat mengawali kita bagaimana untuk berkolaboratif, artinya perbedaan pendapat itu muncul.
It's not easy, but despite the huge range of competing interests, everyone has a stake in ensuring landscapes continue to provide environmental services into the future.
Yang harus dijaga yang pertama hutan. Karena hutan selain untuk melindungi kita semua juga untuk mendatangkan air.
Elemen yang penting adalah bumi.
Gunung Halimun is a very extreme example, if you like, of where we should be applying a landscape approach. It's in an area of extremely high population pressure, lots of other pressures on the land, but it's an incredibly complex landscape because of it. And this is where all of the different interests and stakeholders have to be talking to each other. And this shouldn't just happen on Gunung Halimun. This is an example of what should be happening in all the landscapes that we're interested in.
The scope of the challenge that we face is enormous. It's global and it's unprecedented. What we need to do is to come together to take the many success stories that we have from all over the world, learn from them collectively and apply them at a global scale.